Pearl counted the bills in her wallet for the third time that night. $47. It was everything she owned in this world. She had no idea that within the next few hours, she would give away every last dollar to the mother of the most dangerous mafia boss in New York, and that this decision, which seemed so small, would change her life forever, in a way no one could have imagined. 2:00 in the morning, in January, Brooklyn lay buried beneath a cold so sharp it seemed to slice through skin and bone. Pearl Ashford had just finished her dishwashing shift at an Italian restaurant called Vecchio, where she worked 6 nights a week for meager pay. She stepped into the alley behind the building, her breath freezing into pale white mist before her face. Her hands were rough and cracked from soaking too long in dishwater, and her thin coat was no match for the night wind blowing in from the Hudson River. The streets were empty, with nothing left but the sound of her own footsteps echoing across the damp sidewalk. Pearl walked quickly, head lowered against the wind, thinking of the tiny apartment waiting for her at the end of the road, where at least she could curl beneath a blanket and forget the cold for a while. But as she passed the small park on the corner, Pearl stopped. On an old stone bench sat a figure, hunched and trembling. The streetlight spilled down and revealed an elderly woman dressed in a delicate silk nightgown, her bare feet resting on the frozen ground. Her whole body shook without pause, and her silver hair had come loose and wild in the wind. Pearl stepped closer and saw that the woman's eyes were fixed on empty space, filled with the confusion of someone lost in another world. Her lips moved faintly, murmuring words that made no sense, and now and then she called out a name that sounded almost like a cry of grief. Pearl understood at once. The old woman was lost, and perhaps suffering from dementia. Without a second of hesitation, Pearl took off her own thin coat and draped it over the woman's shoulders, even as she herself began to shiver from the cold. She sat beside her, her voice soft and soothing. "Ma'am, are you all right? Are you here alone?" The old woman didn't answer. She only looked at Pearl with eyes full of panic, clutching the edge of her nightgown as though trying to hold on to something familiar. Pearl looked around. The park was silent and deserted, not a single person in sight to ask for help. She stood and ran to the convenience store on the corner, buying a hot cup of coffee and the last loaf of bread left on the shelf. When she returned, she patiently coaxed the woman to drink in tiny sips, rubbing her frozen hands to bring warmth back into them. In the pocket of the old woman's nightgown, Pearl found an identification card. On it was an address on the Upper East Side, the neighborhood of New York's wealthiest and most powerful people. The name on the card meant nothing to her, but Pearl knew she had to get the woman home. She called a taxi, and the yellow cab pulled up to the curb after a few minutes of waiting. The driver looked at the address, then turned back and named the fare, $45. "Late at night, a long distance, bad weather," he said. The price couldn't be any lower. Pearl opened her wallet and counted the money inside once more. $47. It was her food money for the whole week, her tiny bit of savings for the electric bill that would soon be due. A few silent seconds passed. Pearl looked down at the wrinkled bills in her hand, then over at the old woman trembling beside her. She thought of her empty stomach, of the hungry days ahead, of the freezing apartment with no heat. But then she looked into the woman's frightened, bewildered eyes, the eyes of someone lost and afraid, and the decision was made. Pearl handed all of her money to the driver, carefully repeated the address, and asked him to take the woman all the way to the door and make sure someone was there to receive her. The driver nodded, clearly surprised by what this young woman had done. As the old woman was helped into the cab, she suddenly turned back and gripped Pearl's hand through the lowered window. For a brief, startling moment, her eyes lit up with a rare flash of clarity, as though some piece of memory had returned. "You are a good girl. You have a beautiful heart," she said, her voice trembling, yet strangely sincere. Pearl didn't know what to say. She only offered a faint, awkward smile, patting the woman's hand gently in reassurance. Then the window rolled up, and the taxi slowly pulled away, disappearing into the Brooklyn night. Pearl remained alone in the silent park. The red taillights of the cab grew smaller and smaller, until at last they vanished completely, like a star going dark at the edge of the horizon. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling in the cold now that she had no coat to shield her. The $47 were gone. Her stomach was empty, and the walk home through the winter night still stretched another 20 minutes ahead. But Pearl felt no regret. She had done the right thing, and sometimes that was all a person could do. She started walking, one slow step after another across the frost-covered sidewalk, never knowing that many miles away, at the very top of a skyscraper in Manhattan, one of the most powerful men in the city, was anxiously searching for his mother through the night, and that her life was about to enter an entirely new chapter, one she had never even dared to imagine. If you'd like to know who that powerful man is and what will happen next, please press like to support us. Don't forget to share this story with people who love deeply moving stories. And please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next dramatic episodes. At that same moment, dozens of miles away from Brooklyn, in the most luxurious stretch of Manhattan's Upper East Side, the 40th floor penthouse of a towering skyscraper was still ablaze with light. Jared Castellano was seated in his study, reviewing the contracts that needed his signature the following morning, when the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the silence. The clock read 3 a.m. Jared picked up the call, and the voice on the other end made the most powerful man in New York rise to his feet at once. "Madam's room is empty, sir," the night guard reported, his voice trembling. "We've searched the entire building, but she's nowhere to be found." Jared Castellano was the kind of man the whole city knew and feared. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore black suits even inside his own home, as though he had to be ready at any moment to walk straight into war. His face was angular and cold, marked by a faint scar that ran from his temple down to his left cheek, the remnant of a past he never spoke about. His eyes could force even the most stubborn men to drop their gaze, and his deep, even voice carried the weight of an order that couldn't be challenged. But tonight, at the news that his mother was missing, those eyes flickered, and his hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. He gave the command immediately, his voice still level, yet sharp as a blade. "Everyone goes out now and searches. Every street, every alley, every corner. Leave nothing unchecked. Whoever finds my mother will be rewarded, and whoever let this happen will answer for it." One agonizing hour dragged by as Jared stood by the glass wall, staring down at the sleeping city, his heart burning with dread. His mother, Gwendolyn Castellano, was the only woman left in this world who could still remind him what love felt like. She was in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and now and then she forgot who she was, forgot where she was, forgot the world around her. Jared had hired the finest caregivers money could buy and installed the strictest security system possible. But tonight, all of it had failed. At exactly 4 a.m, a taxi pulled up in front of the building. Jared rushed down to the lobby, and the sight that met him made his heart seem to stop for a beat. His mother was being helped inside by the driver, and draped over her shoulders was an old, worn coat, clearly not one of hers. Gwendolyn saw her son, and her eyes brightened at once. She began murmuring about the kind girl in the park. She gave Mother her coat. She gave Mother hot coffee. She called a cab and sent Mother home. Jared pulled her tightly into his arms, his heart still racing with the terror of almost losing her, while his mind had already begun forming one question after another. Once he was certain his mother had been taken safely back to her room to rest, Jared returned to his study. He sat down in front of the computer screen and accessed the city's public surveillance system, something that, with a man of his power, wasn't difficult to reach. He located the small park where his mother had been found, then rewound the footage to sometime around 2 a.m. A young woman appeared on the screen. She was thin, wearing an old coat, with her hair hastily tied back at the nape of her neck, her face weary, yet her eyes carried a strange and stubborn resolve. Jared watched her remove her coat and place it over his mother's shoulders in the bitter winter cold. He watched her run off to buy coffee, then come back and patiently coax the old woman to drink one sip at a time. He saw her call a taxi, and this was when Jared stopped the footage and zoomed in. The girl opened her wallet and counted her money. It was obvious that it was everything she had, only a few crumpled bills. And still, she handed it all to the driver, keeping not a single dollar for herself. The final part of the video showed her standing alone in the freezing park, with no coat and no money, wrapping her arms around herself before walking away into the darkness. Jared leaned back in his chair and sat in silence for a long time. He'd met every kind of person this life had to offer. People who flattered for money, people who came close for power, people willing to sell out their own blood just to climb a little higher. But this girl, what did she have that made her give away everything like that? He picked up the phone and called Rourke, his most trusted right hand. "Find out who this girl is," he ordered. "Everything. Her name, her address, her job, her past. Don't miss a single detail." Rourke asked carefully, "Has she done something wrong, sir?" Jared looked again at the image of the girl on the screen, his eyes unreadable, complex in a way few people would have understood. "No, she did something that very few people in this world are capable of doing. After Rourke left, Jared remained alone in the vast room. He opened the desk drawer and took out a small box wrapped in red velvet. Inside lay his wife's wedding ring, the woman who had left this world 3 years earlier, in a tragedy he could never forget. Jared stared at the ring for a long time, then set it down and whispered to himself, "She's different. Different from the others I've met. Different from the ones who've always calculated every step. Different from all of them." The next day, Rourke returned with a full report. Pearl Ashford, 27 years old, orphaned at the age of 10 when both parents died in a car accident, raised in shelters and foster homes. She had a theft charge at the age of 18 and received a 2-year suspended sentence. At present, she worked the night shift as a dishwasher at an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, earning less than $1,500 a month. She lived in a studio apartment no bigger than 15 square meters in a slum neighborhood, with no family, no close friends, and no meaningful possessions to speak of. Jared finished reading the report, folded it, and placed it on the desk. "A person with nothing," he said slowly, as though the question were meant for himself as much as anyone else. "And yet she's willing to give away everything." He rose to his feet and walked to the glass wall, looking down at the city as it slowly awakened beneath the first light of dawn. Somewhere in Brooklyn, Pearl Ashford was probably beginning another shift with an empty stomach, never knowing that the most powerful man in the city had taken notice of her life. 2 worlds separated by millions of dollars were about to collide in a way neither of them could have imagined. 3 days after that fateful night, Pearl was still scrubbing her way through a towering pile of pots and pans in the sweltering kitchen of Vecchio. She worked like a machine, her hands moving in endless circles, her eyes fixed on nothing, her mind hollowed out by hunger and lack of sleep. For the past 3 days, she'd survived on scraps of leftover bread from the kitchen and tap water from the sink, waiting for payday so she could afford one decent meal. Then hurried footsteps sounded behind her, followed by the manager's voice, strained in a way she'd never heard before. "Ashford, someone wants to see you. Come out now." Pearl stopped short, so startled she nearly dropped the pan in her hands. In the 9 years since she'd left the shelter system, no one had ever wanted to see her. No one came looking for a dishwashing girl with no family and no friends. She wiped her hands on her stained apron, pushed back her tangled hair as best she could, and followed the manager out to the front of the restaurant. The private dining room sat in the farthest corner, separated from the main floor by heavy red velvet curtains. Pearl stepped inside and froze where she stood. A man was sitting there alone, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, with polished leather shoes that caught the light like mirrors. He carried that invisible force Pearl recognized at once, the kind of power that came from money, from status, from a life spent giving orders and watching others obey. On his little finger gleamed a silver ring engraved with the letter C, though Pearl didn't know it was the symbol of the most powerful family in New York. When she entered, the man rose to his feet, a gesture of courtesy so unexpected that it caught her off guard. The contrast between them was almost cruel in its clarity. He belonged to a world of crystal chandeliers and expensive wine, while she belonged to the dark corner of a kitchen that smelled of grease and dishwater. They stood facing each other, only a few steps apart, yet separated by the distance of 2 entirely different universes. The man spoke, his voice low and even, inviting her to sit down. Pearl shook her head. It was easier to walk away if she stayed standing. He didn't seem offended. He only gave a slight nod and continued. "My name is Jared Castellano. I'm the son of the woman you helped in the park that night." Pearl felt as though someone had struck her square in the chest. Castellano. Everyone in Brooklyn knew that name, and everyone feared it. It was the family that held half the underworld city in its hands, the name people only whispered in the dark. She stepped back once, her spine touching the wall behind her, while the survival instinct honed by 9 years of living alone began sounding every alarm it had. Jared saw the caution in her eyes, and he didn't look surprised. He went on without hesitation. "My mother has Alzheimer's. She forgets things. She wanders. That night was one of the times she slipped away. I searched for her all night, and when she came home, she talked about nothing but a kind girl who gave her a coat, bought her hot coffee, and called a cab to take her home. For the past 3 days, she's spoken of you constantly. She calls you daughter. It's the first time in 3 years that she's remembered anyone that clearly." Pearl didn't know how to respond. She simply stood there in silence, waiting. Jared placed a business card on the table, then said, "I need someone to care for my mother. someone she trusts. The job includes managing the estate, looking after her, and handling household expenses. The salary is $8,000 a month, with room and board included. Consider it my way of repaying the debt from that night." Pearl laughed, a short, cold sound. She looked straight into the eyes of the most powerful man in the city, without the slightest trace of fear. "I don't take charity. $47 isn't worth $8,000 a month. What exactly are you trying to buy?" Jared was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes fixed on her with something unreadable in them. No one spoke to him this way. No one dared. But instead of anger, what stirred in him was curiosity. "This isn't charity," he answered, his voice still calm. "This is a real job. My estate needs a capable manager, and that night you proved that you are one. You stayed calm. You made decisions. You knew how to handle an emergency without panicking. Those are the qualities I need." Pearl stood silent for a long time. She thought of the miserable apartment waiting for her, of the meals she'd missed, of the future ahead of her, dim and airless with no visible way out. Then she thought of all the other times before this. All the times someone had made a generous offer, and she'd ended up paying for it with things she could never get back. At last, she spoke, her voice firm and steady. "1 month on trial, no more. I stay separately, not in the main house. Everything is work, nothing else. And if you, or anyone else, touches me without permission, I walk out immediately. No salary, no explanation." Jared nodded, without the slightest sign of offense crossing his face. "A car will pick you up tomorrow morning at 7. He rose to his feet, set an envelope beside the business card on the table. "Advance payment," then turned toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped and looked back at her. "You don't have to trust me. Just give me one chance to prove myself." Then he was gone, leaving Pearl standing alone in the empty private room. She looked down at the envelope on the table, but didn't touch it. She wouldn't spend a single cent until she was certain this wasn't a trap. She walked to the window and looked outside. The sleek black car was slowly pulling away from the curb, disappearing into the traffic of the city that never slept. For the first time in 9 years, something that felt like hope flickered inside her, small and fragile as a candle in the wind. But Pearl had lived long enough in this world to know that hope was the most dangerous thing of all. It could lift a person up, but it could also hurl them down into depths more brutal than despair itself. She turned and looked at the envelope one last time, then let out a slow breath and walked out of the room, back to the mountain of pots and pans waiting in the sweltering kitchen, the only place she belonged, at least until tomorrow morning. At exactly 7 o'clock the following morning, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the crumbling apartment building where Pearl lived. She'd been awake since 5, sitting on the edge of her bed with her old handbag, the one that held everything she owned, wondering whether she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. But when the horn sounded outside, she rose to her feet, slung the bag over her shoulder, and walked down the rotting staircase without once looking back. The driver was a large man with a face as hard as stone. He didn't say a word. He simply opened the door and waited for her to get in. Pearl slid into the back seat and was struck at once by the scent of real leather and the cool breath of conditioned air, luxuries she'd never known for herself. The car pulled away, leaving Brooklyn behind, and little by little the view beyond the glass began to change. The narrow streets and aging buildings, with their rusted fire escapes and weary walls, gave way to wide roads, lush green trees, and grand estates hidden behind tall gates. After nearly an hour on the road, the car stopped before an enormous iron gate. At its center was an ornate letter C, curved in the same elegant style as the ring on Jared Castellano's finger. The gates opened slowly, and for the first time, Pearl saw the estate of the most powerful family in New York. It was an Italian-style villa set in the middle of a vast property, with dark cypress trees lining the long drive, perfectly manicured lawns stretching on either side, and fountains carved from white marble. Security cameras watched from every angle, and men in black suits patrolled the grounds with unreadable faces. Pearl understood at once. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress, and she had just stepped into the territory of wolves. The car stopped at the main entrance, where a man was already waiting on the front steps. It was Rourke, Jared's right hand. The man Pearl would soon learn was never to be underestimated. He looked about 45, with closely cut salt and pepper hair, and a face that seemed carved from stone, without warmth, without expression. When Pearl stepped out of the car, Rourke looked her over from head to toe, his cold gaze measuring her as though assessing the worth of an object. "You'll be staying in the East Guest House," he said, his voice flat, like a man reciting rules he'd spoken 100 times before. "There are areas of the estate where you're not permitted to go. Don't ask questions that have nothing to do with your work. Don't interact with the boss's guests unless you're told to. Is that understood?" Pearl nodded and said nothing more. She understood the rules of a place like this. Silence and obedience were the safest ways to survive. Rourke led her inside the villa, and Pearl had to force herself to keep her expression calm in the face of what she saw. The ceiling soared high above her, painted with classical murals. Crystal chandeliers spilled light in glittering cascades. The marble floors shone so brightly they could have served as mirrors. There was furniture made of rare wood, draped in deep red velvet. Servants in black and white uniforms moved quietly through the halls, but when they saw Pearl, they slowed, then stopped, their eyes turning toward her. Curious, suspicious, contemptuous, Pearl heard the murmurs behind her back. The dishwashing girl. Why would the boss bring someone like her here? She must have some trick. Just look at her, those cheap clothes. She heard every word, each one of them, but her face didn't change. She was used to this, used to being looked at as though she had no right to stand in any room, no right to exist in any place that seemed even slightly better than the one she'd come from. Rourke brought Pearl to the main sitting room, where Gwendolyn was seated by the window, with the early sunlight falling across her silver hair. At the sound of footsteps, the old woman turned, and her clouded eyes suddenly lit up as though she had just seen a miracle. "Daughter," she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've come. I knew you'd come to me." Gwendolyn rose and moved toward Pearl with the joy of a child who had just found a beloved toy long thought lost. She wrapped her thin, trembling arms around Pearl, holding her tightly, and Pearl stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to do. It was the only warm moment in a first day, filled with strangeness and caution, a simple embrace from a woman she'd barely met, and yet somehow it made her feel more welcomed than any place she'd set foot in during the past 9 years. In the doorway, Jared stood watching in silence. He looked at his mother holding Pearl, looked at the rare smile on her lips, a smile he hadn't seen since her illness had worsened. Something in his gaze was difficult to name. There was relief, certainly, relief that his mother was happy, but there was something else there too, as he looked at the young woman standing so uncertainly in his mother's arms. He didn't step into the room. He only gave a slight nod to Rourke, then turned and walked away, his figure disappearing down the long, shadowed hallway. Later, Rourke took Pearl to the East Guest House, a smaller building set apart from the main villa. The room prepared for her was clean and orderly, with a bed dressed in white sheets, linen curtains, an oak writing desk, and a private bath. It was twice the size of the miserable little apartment in Brooklyn where she'd spent the last 3 years of her life. Pearl set her old handbag down on the bed and looked around, feeling as though she had wandered into a world that had never been meant for her. On her first night at the estate, Pearl lay on the soft bed and stared up at the spotless white ceiling. Around her was absolute silence. No traffic noise. No neighbors arguing through thin walls. No familiar smell of dampness and decay. Everything was too clean, too quiet, too foreign. She wondered if she truly belonged in a place like this, or if this was only some fragile dream that would vanish when the sun came up. 1 month, she reminded herself, whispering into the dark. Just 1 month. Then I'll leave. At that same hour, in the study of the main villa, Jared was still awake. He sat behind his desk beneath the warm glow of a lamp, the light casting shadows across the hard angles of his face. In front of him lay Pearl Ashford's file, and his eyes had come to rest on the line recording the theft charge from when she was 18. Something about it didn't fit. The instinct of a man who had spent his life in a world built on lies and betrayal told him that much. A girl willing to give away everything she had to help a stranger wasn't a thief. He picked up the telephone and dialed Rourke. His voice was cold and decisive. "I want you to dig deeper into the case from when she was 18. Every detail. Every person involved. I want the truth. All of it." Pearl's first week at the Castellano estate passed like a strange dream. Every morning, she woke at 6, got herself ready, and went to Gwendolyn's room to help her with breakfast and her medicine. The old woman had good days and bad ones. Some mornings, she recognized Pearl at once and called her daughter with a radiant smile. Other times, she looked at her with empty eyes and asked who she was, why she was standing in her room. Pearl was patient through all of it. Every time Gwendolyn forgot, Pearl gently introduced herself again, Every time she asked the same question over and over, Pearl answered as though it were the first time she'd heard it. In the mornings, they walked through the vast garden. Gwendolyn loved looking at the roses and talking about the garden she'd once tended when she was young. In the afternoons, Pearl read aloud to her from the old novels she loved, her voice even and soft, like the hush of a lullaby. In her lucid moments, Gwendolyn often spoke to Pearl about the past. She told her about her late husband, a man the outside world had seen only as hard and frightening. Yet when he came home, he was the gentlest of fathers, always making time to read stories to his son before bed. She spoke of Jared as a little boy, a child who used to laugh easily, who loved reading in his father's library, who loved running through the garden and teasing the family's hunting dogs. Then she grew quiet, and her voice turned sorrowful. He changed after his father died. He had to carry the family on his shoulders when he was only 25. Too much responsibility came too early. She paused for a long while before continuing, and after his wife died, he closed his heart completely. He wouldn't let anyone in again, not even his own mother. Pearl listened without comment, but inside her, the image of that cold, distant man began to take on different lines. The lines of someone life had once wounded deeply. On the 5th night, everything changed. The clock read 2 a.m, when a scream tore through the silence of the estate. Pearl shot up from bed, instinct telling her the cry had come from Gwendolyn's room. She ran outside, crossed the dark garden, and rushed into the main villa. The servants had already gathered at the old woman's door, but no one dared go in. They stood there with frightened, uncertain faces. Pearl pushed through them, opened the door, and stepped inside. Gwendolyn was huddled in the corner of the bed, her eyes wide and wild, both hands clutched over her head, as though she were trying to fight off some invisible terror. "Someone is coming," she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "Don't come near me. Don't touch me." She didn't recognize the familiar room. She didn't recognize anyone. She was lost inside a nightmare that even open eyes couldn't free her from. One of the servants moved to call the doctor, but Pearl stopped him with a single motion of her hand. She understood that in a state like this, noise and confusion would only make things worse. She didn't panic. She didn't try to force Gwendolyn to calm down. Instead, she slowly lowered herself to the floor, keeping a safe distance, close enough for the old woman to see her, but not close enough to make her feel threatened. Then Pearl began to sing. It was an old song, simple and gentle, the song her mother had once sung to her on those nights when she was frightened in the shelter, when darkness seemed to swallow everything and little Pearl wanted nothing more than to be held in someone's arms. Her voice was soft, unhurried, without pressure, only a melody drifting through the room like cool water. Little by little, Gwendolyn grew quiet. The wildness in her eyes softened into curiosity, as though the melody were drawing her back from some distant place. She looked at Pearl, her head tilted slightly to one side, and slowly the fear drained from her face, giving way to peace. She crawled toward Pearl, slowly, like a child searching for safety. Then she lowered her head onto Pearl's shoulder, let out a long breath, and fell asleep. Pearl held her and kept singing softly through the rest of the night, until the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains. The next morning, Rourke reported the night's events to Jared. "She handled the situation better than anyone who's ever cared for your mother," he said, his voice still cold, though there was something in it that sounded almost like reluctant respect. "No doctor, no sedatives, just a song, and she calmed your mother and kept her asleep through the whole night." Jared said nothing. He only nodded and turned toward the window. From his study high above, he looked down into the garden below. Pearl and his mother were walking together hand in hand. Gwendolyn was smiling, saying something, her face bright beneath the morning sun. It had been a long time since Jared had seen his mother like that. A very long time since he'd seen her smile with such peace, such simple happiness. That afternoon, while Pearl was reading to Gwendolyn in the sitting room, the old woman suddenly took her hand, her eyes bright with worry. "You'll stay, won't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Please don't leave me. You're the only one who understands me." Pearl looked into her eyes and thought of the song from the night before, the song her mother had left with her before she was gone forever. She thought of all the lonely nights when no one asked after her, of 9 years spent alone with no one needing her at all. "I'll stay," she said, her voice gentle, but certain. "I promise you, I'll stay." Gwendolyn smiled, squeezed Pearl's hand, then closed her eyes and drifted into her afternoon sleep. Pearl sat there, looking at the peaceful face of the old woman, and realized something she hadn't dared admit to herself in 9 years. For the first time in so many years, someone needed her. And perhaps, deep in her own heart, she needed to be needed just as much. 2 weeks after Pearl arrived at the Castellano estate, Jared gave her a new task. He called her into his study and handed her a ring of keys without saying much. "The records room in the basement," he said. "I need you to review the estate's expense ledgers for the past 2 years. Bills, receipts, financial reports. All of it." Pearl took the keys without asking why, without asking what he was looking for. She simply nodded and left. He wanted to test her. She knew that much, and she had no intention of disappointing him. The records room was a large space lined with tall metal shelves, packed with cardboard boxes and file binders. Pearl began working early each morning, sitting among towering stacks of paperwork, cross-checking every figure, every bill, every receipt. This wasn't unfamiliar work to her, back when she'd still been in foster care, when there'd been no money for books or extra schooling. Pearl had spent hours in the public library reading anything she could get for free, from novels to accounting books, from history to mathematics. She'd taught herself how to read financial statements, how to balance ledgers, how to spot irregularities hidden inside rows of numbers. In the long nights at the shelter, when she couldn't sleep because of the noise or the fear, she'd turned knowledge into the only weapon she could truly claim as her own. After a week of careful review, Pearl found something unusual. Small sums had been withdrawn from the estate expense fund, only a few $100s at a time. Never enough to attract attention, but consistently, month after month, over the course of 2 years. She matched them against the bills and receipts. These expenses had no proper documentation, no clear recipient, only numbers that had slipped away into empty space. Altogether, nearly $50,000 had been taken without anyone noticing. Pearl sat back in her chair and stared at the figures on the page. She knew she was holding a bomb in her hands, one that could go off at any moment. That night, Pearl couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, thinking through the choices before her. She could stay silent. This wasn't her business. No one was paying her to point out a traitor, and if she spoke up, the people involved might retaliate. Anyone bold enough to steal from the Castellano family certainly wasn't the gentle kind. But then she thought of Gwendolyn. She thought of the promise she'd made. She thought of the trust Jared had shown when he handed her the keys to the records room. Silence would have made her complicit, and Pearl didn't want to live like that. The next morning, she knocked on the door of Jared's study, carrying a thick stack of files. He looked up from his desk and motioned for her to come in. Pearl placed the documents on the table and spoke in a voice that was brief, clear, and steady. "I found irregular expenses over the past 2 years. These figures don't match any bills or receipts. The total is nearly $50,000. Here's the list of dates, amounts, and receiving accounts. You should look into it. It's your money, not my concern." Jared took the file and turned the pages in silence. His face revealed nothing, but his steel-gray eyes stopped at the figures Pearl had circled in red ink. He wasn't surprised by the amount. $50,000 meant nothing to him. What surprised him was the precision and detail of her report, and the fact that she'd chosen to speak instead of keeping quiet to protect herself. Jared had the matter investigated, and Pearl had been right. The culprit was an accountant who'd worked for the family for 10 years. Someone trusted, someone no one would have suspected. The man was dismissed immediately. No one asked further questions. No one knew where he went after leaving the estate. In this world, betrayal had its own price, and Pearl understood it was better not to ask. The following day, Rourke approached Pearl while she was walking with Gwendolyn in the garden. The large man stopped in front of her, his face still hard as stone, but there was something different in his eyes. He gave her a short nod. "You did well," he said, then turned and walked away. Only 3 words, but from a man like Rourke, it was a rare kind of acknowledgement, one not given lightly. That evening, Jared found Pearl in the back garden, where she was sitting alone on a stone bench. He stood beside her, looking out at the night sky thick with stars, and after a long silence, he asked, "Where did you learn accounting?" Pearl didn't turn her head. Her voice remained even. "The public library. Books were free there, and I had more time than I knew what to do with. On nights when I couldn't sleep in the shelter, I read whatever I could find." Jared was silent for a long while. Then he spoke again, and there was something different in his voice, something softer. You should have gone to college. With a mind like yours, you should have had a better chance than this." Pearl kept staring into the darkness ahead. "A lot of things should have been different," she said, "but they weren't, and I'm still here. That's the only thing that matters." Jared offered to raise her salary, and Pearl refused at once. "You already pay me enough for this job," she said, her voice firm. "Don't turn me into someone who owes you even more. I don't like owing anyone anything." She stood, turned, and walked away without waiting for his response. Jared remained alone in the dark garden, watching her figure disappear behind the trees. In his mind, the same question echoed again and again, one he couldn't answer. Who was she, really? The dishwashing girl with a theft record, or the honest, resilient woman he was watching reveal herself more clearly every day? A month had passed since the day Pearl first set foot on the Castellano estate. She'd grown used to the rhythm of life there, to the morning walks through the garden with Gwendolyn, to the quiet afternoons spent reading by the window, to the strangely peaceful nights in the small room of the East Guest House. Gwendolyn had become more attached to her with each passing day. She called her daughter every day, holding her hand as though afraid she might disappear. The work had gone more smoothly than Pearl had expected. After the embezzlement in the accounting office was uncovered, the household staff became less guarded around her, and now and then Rourke would give her a brief nod in greeting when he passed by. But between Pearl and Jared, there still remained a distance that was careful, polite, and professional. They saw each other at meals when he was present, exchanged a few words about Gwendolyn's condition, then each returned to the separate world that belonged to them alone. That night, a heavy rainstorm came down suddenly over the estate. Pearl lay awake in bed, listening to the rain tapping against the window, unable to sleep. The sound of it brought back the long nights in the shelter, when she'd been a 10-year-old girl who had just lost her parents, curled up on an old bed, listening to the rain and wondering what tomorrow would bring, who might take her in, or whether she'd be moved once again to some other unfamiliar place, some other strange house filled with strangers' faces. The clock struck 1 a.m. Pearl got out of bed, pulled a sweater around herself, and decided to go get some water, and perhaps wander for a little while through the quiet villa. She moved down the dark hallway, her footsteps light as a cat's. As she passed the library on the first floor, she stopped. A faint golden light was spilling through the narrow gap of a half-open door. Pearl meant to keep walking. It wasn't her concern. But something in her, something like curiosity, made her pause. She glanced through the opening and saw Jared sitting alone in the book-lined room, the soft light of a desk lamp casting shadows across the sharp lines of his face. In front of him sat a glass of wine, already half empty, and a small framed photograph. Pearl looked closer. The picture showed a beautiful young woman with a radiant smile and bright, shining eyes. She knew at once that this had to be Jared's late wife, the woman Gwendolyn had once mentioned with such deep sadness. Jared's face in that moment was nothing like the cold expression he wore every day. He looked tired. He looked sorrowful. He looked like a man carrying a grief too heavy to share with anyone. Pearl decided to slip quietly away. This was his private moment, and she had no right to intrude upon it. But just as she turned to leave, Jared's voice came out of the dimness, low and tired. "You can come in. You're not bothering me." He didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. Perhaps he'd known it from the start. Pearl hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. She didn't switch on any more lights. She didn't disturb the darkness that held the room in its hush. She sat down in the chair across from Jared, keeping a respectful distance, and waited. Silence stretched between them. Neither of them spoke. There was only the sound of rain beyond the window and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. At last, Jared broke the silence, his voice rough and low. "Do you know what day it is today?" Pearl shook her head. She didn't know. Jared looked at the photograph, his gray eyes seeming veiled with mist. 3 years exactly. On this day, 3 years ago, she died. He didn't give details. He didn't speak of the circumstances or the cause. He spoke only of the loss, of the emptiness that nothing could fill. "I think I lost the ability to feel," he went on, his voice even, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. "Everything went numb. I still live. I still breathe. I still work. But inside, there's nothing there." He paused, his eyes still fixed on the frame, until he didn't finish the sentence. He left it suspended in the air between them. Pearl was silent for a long while. Then she spoke, her voice quiet and calm, as though she were telling the story of someone else. I understand that feeling. She told him about her parents, how they died in a car accident when she was 10, on a winter afternoon, when they were coming to pick her up from school and never made it home. She told him about the years she'd spent in foster care, moved from one house to another, with no one ever truly wanting to keep her, no one ever truly seeing her as family. I forgot how to trust too, she said. To trust anyone, to believe someone might stay. Because every time I started to believe, they left. They looked at each other in the dim light. There was no touch between them, no promises, nothing at all except the silence and the sound of rain. But in that moment, something passed between them. Something like understanding. Something shared between two souls that life had wounded deeply. For the first time, they truly saw one another. Not as employer and employee, not as a powerful man and a dishwashing girl, but simply as two human beings, carrying wounds that had never fully healed. Jared broke the silence again, his voice softer now. Rourke told me, "You have a record. That case. Do you want to tell me about it?" Pearl was quiet for a very long time. Her eyes turned toward the window, watching the rain trail down the glass. "Not tonight," she said at last. "Maybe not ever. There are some things I don't want to remember." Jared nodded. He didn't press her. "Whenever you're ready, or never. That's your choice." The rain was still falling outside, though more softly now. Pearl rose to her feet. "You should get some sleep," she said. "And so should you. Your mother needs you well. She'll worry if she sees you're tired." She walked toward the door, but before she could step out, Jared's voice came from behind her. "Pearl, thank you for being here tonight." She stopped. It was the first time he'd called her by name, not Miss Ashford, just Pearl, simple and sincere. She gave a small nod without turning back, then stepped out and closed the door behind her. She walked quickly to her room, her heart beating faster than usual, and that frightened her, because she knew that once a heart began to stir, it could also be broken. 2 months after Pearl arrived at the Castellano estate, the Castellano family held its annual charity gala at their Manhattan mansion. It was the biggest event of the year, the kind of evening where hundreds of guests gathered, business magnates, politicians, celebrities, and the most powerful faces in the city all under one roof. Pearl was asked to attend in order to assist Gwendolyn, because the old woman refused to go unless Pearl was at her side. That afternoon, Gwendolyn led Pearl into her dressing room, opened her wardrobe, and took out a long, elegant black gown. "You must wear this tonight," she said with a radiant smile. "I want to see how beautiful my daughter can be." Pearl slipped into the dress and stood before the mirror, barely recognizing the reflection staring back at her. The young woman in the glass had neatly brushed hair, skin that seemed to glow beneath the dark fabric, and eyes that were still guarded, yet carried something different now. She knew she didn't belong in the world of glittering parties and polished wealth, but for Gwendolyn, she would try. That evening, they arrived at the Castellano family's Manhattan mansion. The moment Pearl stepped inside, she felt as though she had crossed into another universe. Crystal chandeliers spilled light like thousands of stars. Champagne flowed into elegant glasses. Lavish gowns and expensive suits drifted through the vast rooms in a constant, glittering current. Pearl walked beside Gwendolyn, doing her best not to draw attention, but the eyes still turned toward her. Who was the girl beside Mrs. Castellano? Who was she? Where had she come from? The whispered questions spread through the crowd like an undertow. Then, from the middle of the room, a woman approached. She looked about 55, dressed in a brilliant red gown that seemed made to command a room. Her neck and wrists were draped in diamonds that flashed beneath the lights. Her smile was flawless, the kind of smile that had been practiced 1,000 times, but her eyes were sharp as blades. Pearl recognized her at once, and the blood inside her seemed to turn cold. Miranda Ashworth, the wife of Senator Ashworth, one of the largest donors to the city's charitable programs, a powerful woman admired by high society. But Pearl knew another Miranda Ashworth, a different Miranda Ashworth, the one who had helped destroy her life. The memory came crashing back like a wave that couldn't be stopped. 9 years earlier, Pearl had been 18, living with her final foster family. One night, their 22-year-old son, drunk and reckless, had come to her room. She fought him off and ran from the house into the dark. But instead of admitting what their son had done, that family accused her of stealing money. They branded her a thief to silence her, to protect their precious son. The police believed the family with money and status. They didn't believe an 18-year-old orphan with no one to defend her. And Miranda Ashworth, as a sponsor of the foster care program, had helped them bury the truth. She had stood by their side. She had helped turn Pearl into the criminal in the eyes of the law. Miranda stopped short the moment she saw Pearl. Her eyes widened for the briefest second, then narrowed into something sharp and dangerous. She moved toward Pearl and Gwendolyn, that sweet artificial smile spreading across her lips. "Why, Pearl Ashford," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "What a surprise to find you here. Do you work for the Castellano family now? How very interesting." Every word carried another meaning beneath it. Every phrase a threat hidden inside the shell of polite society. Pearl didn't lower her eyes. She didn't show fear. She looked straight into Miranda's face, her voice calm and cold. "Yes, I work here." And though her mouth said nothing more, her eyes spoke for her. "I remember everything. I remember what you did to me. Do you remember too?" Gwendolyn felt the tension in the air even if she didn't understand what was happening. She tightened her hold on Pearl's hand, her voice clear and full of pride. "Pearl is my daughter. She's wonderful. She's the kindest person I've ever known." Miranda gave a thin smile, her gaze sliding over Pearl with carefully concealed contempt. "Yes, I'm sure that's true. She must be very special indeed." Across the room, Jared stood watching. He saw the exchange between Pearl and Miranda. He saw the tension in Pearl's body language, the way she held her back straight like someone preparing for battle, the way her shoulders stiffened when Miranda stepped close. He fixed the name in his mind, Miranda Ashworth. He needed to know more about the connection between her and Pearl. Miranda walked away, but before turning fully, she leaned toward Pearl and whispered in a voice low enough for only her to hear. "We'll be seeing each other again very soon, darling. I'm very curious to see how the Castellano family will react when they learn they're keeping a snake in the house." Pearl watched her go, her heart beating hard against her ribs, but her face remained calm, as though nothing at all had happened. She knew the storm was coming. She knew Miranda wouldn't let this go. The past never truly disappears. It only hides in the dark, waiting for the right moment to return and swallow everything she'd struggled to build. A week after the gala, Jared hosted an important dinner with a group of partners he'd been pursuing for months. This was a legitimate deal, a necessary step in moving the Castellano family out of the shadows and into the world of respectable business. Miranda Ashworth was an essential bridge in that effort. Her husband was a senator with enormous influence in political circles, and their support would open doors that money alone could never buy. Pearl knew Miranda would be there, but she couldn't refuse when Gwendolyn held her hand and said she wouldn't go unless her daughter was beside her. For the old woman's sake, Pearl swallowed her fear and stepped into the black car that carried them to the partners' mansion. The dinner was held in a magnificent dining room, with a long table draped in white linen, candles flickering in soft golden light, and fresh flowers filling the air with their fragrance. New York society sat around that table, polished smiles, calculated handshakes, conversations about money and power disguised beneath a thin layer of courtesy. Pearl sat beside Gwendolyn, trying to say as little as possible, trying to make herself invisible among the glittering crowd. But all through the dinner, she could feel Miranda's eyes burning against her skin, the patient, predatory stare of someone waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When dessert was served, Miranda began her attack. She set down her silver spoon and lifted her voice just enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Mr. Castellano, I must say, I'm quite surprised to see Miss Ashford here tonight." Every eye turned toward Pearl like the sharp point of a needle. Miranda continued, her voice as sweet as honey and just as poisonous. "Perhaps everyone here doesn't know this, but this young woman has a criminal record. Theft, if I remember correctly. She was once arrested for stealing money from the foster family who took her in." Whispers spread around the table like a toxic wind. Miranda tilted her head, the smile on her lips sharp as a blade. "I'm truly curious to know what exactly she did to earn such a special place in the Castellano family. She must have some very unusual talents." The meaning beneath those words was unmistakable, cruel in its precision, and a few people let out soft little laughs, small sounds, but enough to tear through the dignity of anyone forced to endure them. Pearl sat there, her face pale as paper, but she didn't lower her head. She didn't defend herself, didn't beg, didn't explain. She simply sat still, her back straight, waiting for the storm to pass the way she had for 9 long years, whenever the world turned its back on her. But in that moment, Her eyes searched for one person. Jared. The man who had told her he didn't believe everything written in her file, the man who had sat with her on that rainy night in the library and shared the weight of his own grief, the man her heart had begun to open to even though she knew how dangerous that was. Their eyes met across the long table. Jared parted his lips, as if he were about to say something, but then he looked around at the partners seated at the table, the people he had spent months trying to persuade, the people who held the keys to the family's future in the legitimate world. He looked at Miranda, the woman whose husband was a senator, the most important bridge in this entire arrangement, and then he said nothing. His steel-gray eyes lowered to the plate in front of him, avoiding Pearl's gaze like a coward. He didn't speak. He chose silence. Pearl saw everything, the hesitation in his eyes, the cold calculation, the decision made in a single instant. He chose the deal. He chose power. He chose the future of his family over protecting her. Pearl's heart, the heart that had begun to open after that rainy night in the library, shut itself with a sound only she could hear. She rose slowly, with a calm that felt almost unreal. She leaned down and spoke softly to Gwendolyn. "I have to go, ma'am. I'm sorry I can't stay." Gwendolyn clutched her hand, her clouded eyes full of worry. "Daughter, where are you going?" Pearl gently eased her hand free and gave her a sad smile. Then she straightened her back and walked toward the door. Her spine was straight, her chin was lifted high. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't turn back even once. Miranda watched her go with the smile of victory resting on her lips, her voice filled with false sympathy. "Oh, she's so sensitive. Poor thing. I never meant to hurt her." Jared stared after Pearl's disappearing figure as she vanished into the darkness beyond the doorway, his hand clenched beneath the table until his knuckles turned white. The deal went on. The conversation went on. Laughter still rose around the table. But inside Jared's chest, something had just died, and he knew he'd never get it back. Pearl sat alone in the taxi, wrapped in darkness. Streetlights slid across the window in blurred streaks of gold. And now, with no one left to watch her, she allowed herself to tremble. Her shoulders shook, but not because of Miranda. She was used to the cruelty of the world, used to humiliation, used to contempt. She was trembling because of Jared's silence, because of the way he lowered his eyes when she needed him most, because she had allowed herself to trust, and once again, she had trusted the wrong person. 9 years ago, no one believed her. Tonight, history had repeated itself. She stared out through the window at the city rushing past in the darkness, and she knew there was nothing left to keep her at the Castellano estate. That night, Pearl returned to the estate in silence. She didn't turn on the light. She simply sat beside the window, looking out at the garden lying under darkness. Weak moonlight filtered through the trees, casting strange shapes across the ground. She thought about everything that had happened over the past 2 months, about Gwendolyn and their morning walks through the garden, about the song in the night of terror, about numbers that didn't lie, about the rainy night in the library, when 2 wounded souls had reached across the silence and touched each other. And she thought about tonight, about Jared's silence, about the way his eyes had lowered when she had needed him most. Once again, she had placed her trust in the wrong place. Pearl took paper and a pen from the desk drawer. She wrote 2 letters. The first was for Jared, brief and professional, without a word of accusation, without a single explanation. Only a few short lines. "Thank you for the opportunity. I understand. Pearl Ashford." Those 2 words, "I understand," carried more weight than any accusation ever could. Heavier than tears, heavier than pleading, heavier than blame. The second letter was for Gwendolyn, and it was longer, every word cutting like a blade into flesh. "You are the mother I never had in this life. The months I spent beside you were a gift I never expected to receive. I'm sorry I have to leave, but I can't stay in a place where I am not respected. Please don't be sad. I'll remember you always. Your daughter, Pearl." She rose to her feet and looked around the room. 2 months. Long enough to begin hoping. Not long enough to call this place home. She left behind everything Gwendolyn had given her. The elegant black dress, the soft scarves, the little things the old woman had thoughtfully prepared for her. She took only the same old handbag she'd arrived with. No more and no less. Because those were the only things that truly belonged to her. At 4 a.m, the entire estate lay asleep. Pearl quietly left the guest house, crossed the dark garden, and entered the main villa. She went to Gwendolyn's room and opened the door as softly as she could. The old woman was sleeping peacefully, her gentle face bathed in moonlight from the window. Pearl stood there for a long time, looking at the woman who had called her daughter, who had held her, who had needed her. From the pocket of her coat, she took out an old handkerchief, its edges worn thin with time, one corner embroidered with a small flower in threads that had long since faded. It was the only thing her mother had left her, the one possession she'd carried for 17 years, through shelters, through foster homes, through endless lonely nights. She placed the handkerchief on Gwendolyn's bedside table, beside the Castellano family photograph and the letter she had written. Pearl stood looking at her for a long time, then whispered, her voice catching painfully in her throat. "I'm sorry. I wish I could stay, but I can't." She bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to Gwendolyn's forehead, feeling the coolness of her skin and breathing in the familiar scent of the perfume the old woman always wore. Then she straightened, turned away, and walked out without looking back, because she knew that if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to keep going. At 5 a.m, just as the sky was beginning to pale, Pearl walked out through the estate gates. She called a taxi, and it carried her back to Brooklyn, back to the miserable studio apartment she'd left behind 2 months earlier. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, dark, damp, cramped, with the familiar smell of mildew hitting her the moment she opened the door. But now the apartment felt colder than she remembered, because Pearl had learned what warmth felt like, had learned what it was to be cared for, and now she knew how much it hurt to lose those things. The following morning at the estate, Rourke knocked on the door of Jared's study. "Sir, Miss Ashford has left," he said, his voice as cold and controlled as ever. "She left 2 letters, one for you, one for your mother." Jared took the letter and opened it. His face gave nothing away, but his hand tightened around the paper until it crumpled. "I understand." Those 2 words cut deeper than any curse could have, heavier than any accusation, because they said everything, that she understood what he had chosen, that she wasn't blaming him, and that she would never come back. Gwendolyn woke and called for Pearl as she did every morning. When Pearl didn't come, panic took hold of her. She began searching the room frantically. Then she saw the handkerchief on the bedside table, and the letter beside it. She read every word with trembling hands, then clutched the handkerchief to her chest and wept like a child. "My daughter," she sobbed. "Why did you leave me? Why did you go?" Jared stood in the doorway, watching his mother cry, and couldn't say a word. He had no answer for her, because the answer was him. It was his silence at the dinner table the night before. That night, Jared sat alone in the library, the room where they had spoken during the rainstorm. The deal had succeeded. He had gained everything he'd wanted in business, but he'd lost the respect he had for himself. He'd lost the girl who had made his mother smile again. He'd lost the only person who had seen the man beneath the cold shell he showed the world. He looked out the window. The sky was darkening, black clouds gathering along the horizon. The forecast said a major snowstorm was coming to New York, the worst storm the city had seen in many years. 2 days after Pearl left the estate, a historic snowstorm descended on New York. It was the worst storm the city had seen in 20 years, with snow falling so thick and fast that every street disappeared beneath a white shroud, and winds so violent they snapped tree limbs and shattered windows. Power was lost in many neighborhoods, the roads froze solid, and city officials urged everyone to remain indoors and not venture outside, except in cases of absolute emergency. Brooklyn was among the hardest hit, especially the old apartment buildings with failing heating systems and windows that no longer sealed against the cold. At the Castellano estate, Rourke stepped into Jared's study with a troubled look on his face. "Sir, I just received word. The apartment building where Miss Ashford lives has lost power completely. Several windows have been blown out by the storm. That building is old and unsafe in weather like this." Jared stood by the window, watching the snow come down in heavy curtains beyond the glass, his gray eyes fixed on some faraway place only he could see. He was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, his voice sharp with certainty. "Get the car ready for me." Rourke froze. "Sir, the roads are impossible. The authorities have banned all traffic. Going out in weather like this would be suicide." But Jared had already pulled on a heavy coat, tugged on his gloves, and started toward the door. "I'm not asking your opinion, Rourke." Rourke moved in front of him. "Sir, please think this through." Jared looked straight into the eyes of the man who had stood beside him for years, and his voice came low and steady. "She's out there, alone, in this storm, because of me, because of my silence. I won't let her die out there while I sit here in safety." Jared drove himself, refusing to let anyone come with him. The black SUV pushed through streets buried in snow, with visibility nearly gone, and winds so fierce they rocked the vehicle over and over. More than once the tires slipped on the ice, nearly sending the car out of control. But Jared didn't stop. He drove through the storm like a madman, both hands locked around the wheel, his eyes straining through the white fury ahead. He thought of Pearl. He thought of her miserable little apartment. He thought of her freezing somewhere alone, and his foot pressed harder on the gas. When he reached Pearl's building, the scene was worse than he'd imagined. The old structure stood alone in the storm, battered and trembling, with some of its windows blown out completely and snow pouring through the broken openings. The power was out, and the stairwell lay in darkness beneath a thin skin of ice. Jared climbed to the 5th floor, slipping more than once on the frozen steps. He pounded on Pearl's apartment door. No answer. He knocked harder. Still silence. He pushed the door open. It wasn't locked, and the room was empty. Pearl wasn't there. Jared knocked on the neighboring apartment, and an old woman answered with a candle in her hand, her wrinkled face flickering in the wavering light. "Pearl, the girl," she said, her voice trembling from cold. "She left around noon. Said she was going to find some little boy, the one who always came to study with her. Connor, I think that was his name. His home is somewhere near the old harbor." Jared thanked her, then rushed back down the stairs. He knew at once that Pearl had gone looking for the child she tutored, the child she worried about more than she ever worried about herself. Jared drove toward the old harbor, an area filled with abandoned warehouses and crumbling buildings. It was dangerous even in good weather. In a snowstorm, it looked like a white hell. He stopped the car and pushed forward on foot through the wreckage, shouting Pearl's name. The wind snatched his voice away and swallowed it into the storm. He moved with painful effort, step by step, through snow that reached his knees, the cold cutting into his flesh even through the thick coat he wore. Then he saw it, an abandoned bus shelter with part of its roof still intact, and inside it, a figure. Pearl was curled in the corner of the shelter, holding a boy tightly against her. Connor, 12 years old, his face pale blue with cold, was wrapped in Pearl's coat. Pearl herself wore only a thin layer of clothing, her lips tinged purple, her hands shaking so hard she couldn't control them. She had given everything to the boy, her coat, the warmest place beneath the shelter, whatever little protection she had, and had left herself to sit exposed while the cold slowly stole the life from her body. Connor told Jared in a trembling voice that his father had come home drunk and violent, smashing things around the house. He'd been so frightened that he'd run away. Pearl had found him wandering in the storm and brought him there to shelter. Jared didn't waste words. He didn't stop to ask questions. He took off his own coat and wrapped it around Pearl, then bent and lifted her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and the lightness of her hurt him, as though she hadn't had a real meal in days. He brought Connor with them too, wrapping the boy in an extra blanket from the car. Jared carried Pearl back through the storm, each step heavy and difficult, but unyielding, until he laid her gently in the back seat of the SUV. Inside the vehicle, Jared turned the heat as high as it would go, and drove back through the blizzard toward the estate. Pearl opened her eyes, clouded with exhaustion, and through the haze of fading consciousness she saw his face. Her voice came out faint as breath. "Why are you here?" Jared didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but his hand found hers and held it tightly, offering warmth and a promise that didn't need words. By the time they reached the estate, the family doctor was already waiting. Pearl was suffering from hypothermia, but the doctor said she would recover. She needed warmth, rest, and time. Connor was cared for as well, fed and wrapped in blankets. When Pearl woke in the warm room, Jared was still sitting beside her, his gray eyes fixed on her face. "You almost died out there," he said, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken in hours. Pearl looked at him, her eyes weary, but still guarded. "I've survived worse than that." Jared lowered his head and sat in silence for a moment. Then he lifted his gaze to hers again, and his gray eyes no longer held their usual coldness. Instead, they carried something closer to regret, and something stronger still. Something like resolve. "This time, I won't stay silent. I promise." Pearl didn't answer. She wasn't ready to forgive him. The wound was still too new, and the memory of his silence at the dinner table still burned. But she didn't ask him to leave either, and perhaps that, in itself, was a beginning. A week after the historic snowstorm, Pearl had fully recovered. She remained at the estate, but when Jared asked, she told him plainly that she was staying for Gwendolyn, for the promise she'd made to the old woman, not for him. Jared didn't argue. He accepted that as a punishment he deserved for his silence. The two of them kept their distance. There were no more conversations in the rainy dark, no more glances that quietly searched for each other. Yet the cold tension that had once stood between them had softened. Jared arranged for Connor to stay temporarily in the guest house. The boy was enrolled in school, given proper meals, and cared for. And every afternoon he still came to study with Pearl, just as before. In his study, Jared summoned Rourke. The moment his right hand stepped inside, Jared went straight to the point without hesitation. "Miranda Ashworth," he said, his voice cold and steady. "I want you to find out everything about her, especially her connection to Pearl Ashford. Everything she's done, everything she's hiding. I want all of it." Rourke nodded, and something like satisfaction flashed in his eyes. "I've been waiting a long time to hear you say that, sir," he replied, then turned and walked out. Rourke put the full resources of the Castellano family behind the investigation. His people dug through old records from the foster care system, bribed corrupt officials, and threatened those who knew too much but had been too afraid to speak. They uncovered documents that had been buried for 9 long years, evidence that should have come to light long ago, but had been smothered beneath money and power. The truth about Pearl's case began to emerge piece by piece. Pearl had never stolen anything, just as Jared had suspected from the moment he'd first read her file. The evidence clearly showed that the original testimony from the Foster family was full of contradictions. There was no physical evidence confirming any theft, no missing money, no fingerprints, nothing at all beyond their word. The truth was this: the Foster family's son, 22 years old and drunk, had attacked Pearl in the garage when she was 18. Pearl had fought back and run, and to protect their son, to silence the orphaned girl who had no one to defend her, the family accused her of stealing money. Miranda Ashworth, in her role as a major sponsor of the foster care program, had helped them bury the truth. The reason was painfully simple. The Foster family's son was a blood relative of Senator Ashworth, her husband. But that wasn't all. The investigation uncovered something even darker. Miranda Ashworth had been embezzling money from the orphan fund for years. Millions of dollars that should have gone toward caring for and educating children with nowhere to turn had been funneled into her private accounts. She had used her position as a donor to cover her crimes and silence anyone bold enough to speak. Pearl was only one of many victims, one of many children pushed into darkness so Miranda could continue living in the glittering light of high society. Rourke returned to Jared's study and laid a thick file on the desk. "Sir," he said, his voice low and heavy, "she's innocent. She always was. She never stole a thing. She was just an 18-year-old girl driven into a corner." He paused, then continued. "And Miranda Ashworth, she's a monster wearing a human face. She destroyed the lives of God knows how many children to protect her family and enrich herself." Jared took the file and read it page by page, line by line, his hands tightening until his knuckles turned white. Every page was another fragment of the truth Pearl had been forced to carry for 9 years. Jared found Pearl in the back garden, where she was sitting alone on the stone bench, looking out at the flowers blooming beneath the late afternoon sun. He sat down beside her and placed the file in her hands. "I found the truth," he said, his voice low and grave. "It's all here." Pearl opened the file and read each page, her hands trembling slightly. 9 years of injustice lay there in black ink on white paper. 9 years of being called a thief. 9 years of doors slammed shut in her face. 9 years of no one believing her. And now, for the first time, someone believed her, and there was proof of her innocence. Pearl lifted her eyes to Jared. They were bright, but she didn't cry. "What do you intend to do with this?" she asked, her voice calm, though it trembled faintly beneath the surface. Jared met her gaze without flinching. "Give justice back to you, if you'll let me." Pearl gave a small shake of her head. "I don't need you playing the role of some knight in shining armor." Jared nodded. "I know. You don't need anyone to save you. You've been saving yourself for 9 years. You survived all of it without anyone's help." He paused, then went on. "But you deserve to stand in the light, not in the darkness other people forced you into." Pearl sat in silence for a long while, looking down at the file in her hands. 9 years. 9 years of living with the stain of being called a thief. 9 years of the world turning its back on her. 9 years of wondering whether anyone would ever believe her. Then she looked up and met Jared's gray eyes. "All right," she said, her voice steady now. "Do whatever you need to do." Jared nodded, and his eyes no longer held their old coldness. They held a promise instead. "This time, I won't stay silent. I promise you." 1 week after the investigation, Jared called an important meeting at the Castellano building in Manhattan. The conference room was on the highest floor, with glass walls overlooking the entire city, a long polished oak table, and expensive leather chairs lined up in perfect order. Every major partner had been invited. Influential businessmen, powerful politicians, the people who held key positions in New York's upper society. And Miranda Ashworth was there as well. She entered the room wearing her usual confident smile, her sea-green dress shimmering beneath the lights, completely unaware that a storm was waiting for her. When the conference room doors opened again, every eye turned in that direction. Jared walked in, and beside him was Pearl. She was no longer the girl standing behind someone else, no longer lowering her head or avoiding people's gaze. She wore a simple black dress, her back straight, her eyes steady, walking side by side with the most powerful man in the room. The moment Miranda saw Pearl, the smile on her lips froze. She tried to remain composed, but caution had already surfaced in her eyes. "Mr. Castellano," she said, her voice still sweet, though strained now. "I don't understand why Miss Ashford is here at this meeting. This meeting is for partners, not for servants." Jared didn't answer at once. He walked to the head of the table, stood at its center, and when he spoke, his calm voice carried through the entire room. "Today, I have an important announcement for all of you," he said. "Starting today, Pearl Ashford will become the Chief Executive Director of the Castellano Charity Foundation. She'll be responsible for overseeing and managing the foundation's entire operation." Murmurs spread through the room, startled glances, hushed exchanges. Miranda let out a laugh, her voice dripping with contempt and disbelief. "Is this a joke, Mr. Castellano? A woman with a theft record running a charity foundation. You need to reconsider this decision. Your reputation, and the reputation of everyone in this room, will be seriously damaged." Jared looked straight into Miranda's eyes, his voice cold as steel. "Miss Ashford's record was a false conviction," he said, every word clear and final. The room fell into complete silence. "And the person responsible for that false conviction," he continued, his gray eyes sharp as blades, "is sitting in this very room." Miranda's face went white, but she still tried to hold herself together. "What are you talking about?" she said. "This is slander." The conference room doors opened, and Rourke entered carrying a thick stack of documents. He moved around the table, placing a copy in front of each person. "This is the result of our investigation," Jared said. "Evidence that Miranda Ashworth embezzled millions of dollars from orphan funds over the course of many years. Evidence that she helped cover up the assault of an 18-year-old girl in order to protect her husband's relative. And evidence that she framed the victim as a thief in order to silence her." The partners opened the files and read page after page, their faces gradually turning cold as the truth revealed itself. Miranda held the file in trembling hands, and the color of her face shifted from pale white to ashen gray. Jared continued, his voice never shaking. "Miranda Ashworth stole money from children who had no one to protect them," he said. "She destroyed the life of an innocent young woman in order to protect her own family." He paused, then turned to Pearl. "And I stayed silent while she humiliated Pearl in front of everyone. I chose the deal instead of what was right. I was wrong." Jared turned fully toward Pearl, his gray eyes meeting hers without wavering. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I chose advantage over conscience. I didn't deserve the trust you placed in me. But I hope that starting today, I can begin to do what is right." Miranda shot to her feet, her face twisted with rage. "This is slander," she screamed. "I'll sue every one of you. I'll destroy all of you." But when she looked around for support, she found none. The partners were still reading the files, their faces hard as ice. No one looked at her. No one stood beside her. She was completely alone. Pearl stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice rang through the room with clarity and strength. "I don't need anyone's pity," she said. "I never have. I only need the truth. And today, the truth has finally been spoken." She looked straight at Miranda without the slightest fear. "For 9 years, I've lived with the label of thief," she continued. "For 9 years, Every door was closed in my face. For 9 years, I've been looked at with contempt and pushed into the shadows. Today, I take back my name. Not because of Mr. Castellano, but because I deserve to stand here. Miranda was asked to leave the conference room. She walked out with her back bent, no trace left of the arrogance she'd carried when she first entered. One by one, the partners rose from their seats, shook Jared's hand, and signed their commitments to support the Castellano Charity Foundation under its new leadership. Pearl stood in the middle of the room as light poured through the glass walls and fell across her face. For the first time in 9 years, she was standing in the light, not in the darkness where others had forced her to live. And she stood there not because someone had rescued her, but because she had claimed that place for herself. After the partners' meeting, the news spread through New York high society like wildfire. Miranda Ashworth was placed under formal investigation for embezzling charity funds, and the evidence Rourke had gathered was far too clear to be denied. Senator Ashworth, her husband, was forced to resign in the middle of his term when the scandal broke, and the political career he'd spent 30 years building collapsed in a matter of days. The foster care program across the entire city was subjected to a full audit, and the cracks Miranda had exploited for years were finally dragged into the light. Multiple staff members and public officials connected to the scheme were suspended, and for the first time in history, the child protection system was being examined with genuine seriousness. 1 week later, the Castellano Charity Foundation held a public press conference to introduce its new leadership. Reporters from the major newspapers were there, cameras flashing without pause, and the rows of seats were packed with people who wanted to witness this historic change for themselves. Pearl stood at the podium as the foundation's chief executive director, wearing a simple black dress, her hair neatly tied back at the nape of her neck, her steady eyes fixed on the crowd before her. She spoke about the foundation's new vision, about building support centers for children in the foster care system, about making certain that no child would ever have to endure what she herself had lived through. In the middle of the press conference, a small figure rose from the audience. Connor, the 12-year-old boy Pearl had saved during the snowstorm, his face flushed red with nerves, his hand gripping the edge of his new shirt. He stepped into the center aisle, his voice trembling, but carrying clearly through the silent room. "I'd like to say something, please. Just give me 1 minute." Everyone turned to look. A child standing among adults in expensive suits and elegant dresses. Pearl moved as if she were about to step down and stop him, but Jared placed a hand on her shoulder and gave a small shake of his head. Let him speak. Connor stood in the middle of the room, small, but not afraid. His voice shook, but he didn't stop. "Miss Pearl taught me how to read when nobody cared enough to bother," he said. "She bought me food when I was hungry, even though she didn't have much money herself. She shared what little she had with me when I had nothing at all." The boy paused, swallowed hard, then went on. "When the snowstorm came, when my father got drunk and I had to run away, Miss Pearl was the only one who came looking for me. She gave me her coat. She sat out in the freezing cold so I could stay warm. She almost died because of me." Connor looked around the room, at all the faces watching him in silence. "People said she was a thief," he said, and now his voice was stronger. "But she gave me everything she had. Thieves don't do that. Only good people do that. And Miss Pearl is the best person I've ever known in my life." The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then somewhere, from one corner, applause began. One person, then two, then the entire room. The applause rolled through the hall in waves. Some people wiped tears from their eyes, even those who had once doubted Pearl. Pearl stepped down from the podium and went to Connor. The boy threw his arms around her and sobbed into her shoulder. "Thank you, Miss Pearl. Thank you for not abandoning me." Pearl held him close, and her own eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. "No," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you for believing in me." In the corner of the room, Rourke stood watching. The hard, cold man who had once looked at Pearl with suspicion when she first arrived at the estate now gave a slight nod, and there was something in his eyes that looked very much like respect. He turned to the man beside him, his voice low and rough. "She has something money can't buy," he said. "She has a conscience." In the front row, Gwendolyn sat with tears streaming down her lined face. In her hands, she held the old handkerchief with the worn edges, the handkerchief Pearl had left behind when she walked away. Gwendolyn had kept it with her every day, held it every night, as though it carried some living piece of the daughter she had feared she might never see again. And now her daughter had come back, standing in the light, respected and loved. She smiled through her tears and whispered to herself, "My daughter, The press conference came to an end, and little by little, the room began to empty. Outside the building, Pearl stood beneath the clear blue sky of New York, looking upward. Connor stood beside her and tugged lightly at her sleeve. "Miss Pearl, can I help you build the new center?" he asked. "I want to do something. I want to help other kids like me." Pearl looked down at him and smiled. A real smile. Not forced, not hidden. The first true smile she'd given in many years. "Of course," she said. "We'll build it together. Together." 3 months later, spring came to New York. Trees were budding with new life. Tulips and cherry blossoms were blooming across the parks, and warm sunlight had begun to drive away the bitter memory of winter. In Brooklyn, in the very place that had once been a slum of decaying buildings and shattered windows, something new had risen. It was a 3-story building with a bright white facade, large windows welcoming in the sun, and a vibrant sign hanging proudly in front. New Roots, a community center for children in foster care. The grand opening took place on a beautiful morning. Hundreds of people were there. Reporters, donors, volunteers, and most important of all, the children for whom this place had been built. Colorful balloons floated into the sky, cheerful music filled the air, and on the small stage in front of the building, Pearl stood waiting. She was no longer the dishwashing girl in the dark kitchen of Vecchio, no longer the young woman with cracked hands and a paper-thin coat. She was the chief executive director of the Castellano Charity Foundation, dressed in a simple blue dress, her brown hair falling naturally over her shoulders, her eyes shining with faith and hope. Pearl lifted the microphone, looked out at the crowd, and began to speak. "I was once a child in the foster care system," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I know what it feels like to wake up every morning and not know where you belong, not know which house you'll be sent to next, not know who you're supposed to call your parents tomorrow. I know what it feels like to be judged by what other people say about you, instead of what you've actually done, to be labeled, to be defined by circumstances you never chose for yourself." She paused for a moment and looked across the crowd, across the young faces listening with such careful attention. "Today, I'm standing here to tell every one of you that you matter," she continued. "No one has the right to define who you are. Only you have that right. You define yourselves by what you do, by how you treat other people, by the strength you show every single day. And if you still haven't found the place where you belong, then let us help you build it, right here, at New Roots." In the front row sat Connor, the 12-year-old boy who now had a new foster family, a real family who truly loved him, a family arranged and carefully followed by the Castellano Foundation. He clapped louder than anyone else, his eyes bright, his smile radiant on a face no longer pale with cold and fear the way it had once been. Beside him sat other children too, former foster children whom Pearl had helped connect to resources, to families, to new chances in life. Rourke stood at the doorway of the building, his face still as hard as stone, but there was something warmer now in his eyes, and when Pearl finished speaking, he gave a quiet nod. Jared stood behind the crowd, not on the stage, not beside Pearl beneath the flashing lights of the reporters' cameras. This was her day, not his. He only stood there, his gray eyes warm as they followed her every movement, every smile, and within him, something he had believed dead for a very long time had begun to live again. In the front row, Gwendolyn sat in her wheelchair, more clear-minded than she had been in years. When Pearl stepped down from the stage, the old woman reached for her hand and held it tightly, her clouded eyes full of love. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "My daughter." And in her hand was the old handkerchief with the frayed edges, the handkerchief Pearl had left behind when she'd gone away, the handkerchief that had once belonged to her mother. Gwendolyn placed it in Pearl's hand. "I kept it for you every day," she said. "I knew you'd come back. I always knew." Pearl took the handkerchief, her fingers trembling as they brushed the faded cloth. "You keep it for me," she said, her voice catching with emotion. "I don't need it anymore. I have a home now." The ceremony came to an end, and little by little, the guests began to leave. Pearl stood in front of the New Roots building, looking up at the sign, looking at the children running and laughing in the yard, looking at the future she had helped build with her own hands. Jared came to stand beside her. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood there in silence. "You've done something many people thought was impossible," he said at last, his voice low and warm. Pearl gave a small shake of her head. "Not alone. A lot of people helped. I couldn't have done this by myself." Jared smiled. "You still refuse to take the credit?" Pearl smiled too. Old habit, hard to break. They stood side by side, watching the sun sink lower at the horizon as the sky turned from blue to gold, then softened into rose. They didn't need to say much. Simply standing there together was enough. "We've come a very long way," Pearl said, her voice as gentle as the wind. Jared nodded. "And there's still farther to go, if you want that." Pearl turned and looked at him, looked into those gray eyes that were no longer cold, but filled instead with warmth and honesty. "I do," she said, as simply as that, without grand promises, without dramatic declarations. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. New roots had already taken hold in the earth, and from here, everything would grow. One Sunday morning, the Castellano estate was drenched in spring sunlight. Pearl and Gwendolyn were kneeling beside the flower bed in front of the house, their hands covered in soil as they planted new rose bushes together. Jared stepped out through the front doors carrying a tray with hot coffee and pastries, then set it down on the small garden table. It had become their new ritual. Every Sunday morning, the three of them shared breakfast, talked, laughed, and enjoyed the kind of peace none of them had ever dared to dream of before. They were like a family, though no one said it aloud. Gwendolyn sat down in her chair and took a sip of coffee, her eyes bright with one of those rare flashes of clarity. She looked at Pearl, then at Jared, then back at Pearl again. "How long are you two planning to keep pretending like this?" she asked suddenly, her voice clear and sharp. Pearl and Jared looked at each other, both too caught off guard to know what to say. Gwendolyn waved a dismissive hand. "I'm old, but I'm not blind," she said. "I see the way you look at each other. I see the way you care for each other. Life is short. Don't waste it pretending." Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and went back inside the house for her afternoon rest, leaving Pearl and Jared alone in the garden among the flowers in full bloom. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. At last, Jared spoke, his voice soft and touched with something close to uncertainty. "Was she right?" Pearl looked off into the distance, watching the flowers sway in the breeze. "Maybe," she answered, her voice as light as the wind itself. Jared slipped a hand into his pocket and took out a small box wrapped in blue velvet. He opened it. Inside was a simple silver ring, with no diamond, no gemstone, only pure silver, with 2 initials delicately engraved on the inside. "This isn't a wedding ring," he said quickly, "and it isn't a proposal either. It's just a gift, a reminder of what we're building together, of the fact that we'll keep walking this road together from here on." Pearl took the ring and slipped it onto her finger, turning it gently beneath the sunlight. The 2 letters glimmered there. N.R. New roots, she read softly. "I like the sound of that." Pearl looked down at her hands that had once been rough and cracked from spending endless nights in dishwater, and though traces of those old calluses still remained, they were now holding the plans for the second community center that would soon be built. On her finger, the silver ring caught the sunlight. She lifted her face toward the clear blue spring sky and smiled, the smile of someone who had finally found where she belonged. Someone once said that $47 couldn't buy anything in New York City, but Pearl knew differently. $47 had bought her a chance. That chance had become a home, and that home had become everything. Thank you all for staying with this story until the very last moment. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below and share what rose from the deepest part of your heart. We'd truly love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to press like and share it with your friends and loved ones so more people can hear stories that mean something. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please press the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the moving videos we share each day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.